2,000 years later. 6½ hours later. A few inches later. Day 2. Day 3. Day 4. A few moments later. 1 eternity later. 3 days later. 12 seconds later. 3:28 a.m. 3 weeks later. Many months later. So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one. Tomorrow. Tomorrow for sure. Eventually. 12 o'clock midnight. 1 hour later. 2 hours later. 3 hours later. Can you move it along? I'm all out of time cards. Meanwhile. 2 hours later. 8:01 p.m. The next day. Later. 20 minutes later. 6 hours later. Several bad puns later. 70 years later. Meanwhile. 6 hours later. Later that same evening. Several days later. 6 months later. 2 hours later. 4 to 6 weeks later. 1 minute, 37 seconds later. 1 debt to society later. 1 pair of pants later. 8 hours later. 298 frozen patties later. 3 hours later. Epilogue. The next day. Meanwhile at the Krusty Krab. 10 seconds later. 346 minutes later. Much later. 3 days later. Opening night. Later. 3,000 years later. 1 week later. 7:59 a.m. 3 weeks later. 3 days later. 2 hours later. 48 hours later. 8 hours later. The following Thursday. 5 minutes later. 24 hours later. Much later. Much later. 7 hours later. Epilogue. Several song-filled hours later. A few minutes later. A little longer than a few minutes later. 3 days later. 15 minutes later. Several months later. Thousands of tears later. 16 paranoia-filled days later. 2 hours later. Much later. Yesterday. Many hours later. 75 years later. 2 hours later. 1 extremely annoying shift later. 2 very boring minutes later. 3 hours later. 1 whiner later. The following day. Meanwhile. Later. Just then. What follows is a brief construction montage. We hope you enjoyed this brief construction montage. Meanwhile, back in the lowlands. 1 frozen wasteland later. 1 hour later. 5 hours later. 2 days later. Later, in the void. Approximately 10 hours later. Early, the next morning. 1 shift later. 2 weeks later. 11 minutes later. 5 minutes later. A lot of boring math later. 24 hours later. 1 week later. 1 long, angry line later. 72 hours later. 2 hours later. Just then. By sheer coincidence. The next morning. Montage. The next morning. Many tic-tacs later. Flashback. End of flashback. The very next evening. 1 hour later. The next day. Later. 4 to 6 days later. 4 to 6 more days later. The next morning. Moments later. More moments later. 1 semester later. Graduation day. 1 hour later. 5 minutes later. 80,000 impressions later. Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying. 3,000 whip poos later. Soon after. Later. Moments later. The next morning. 20 unbearable hours later. Single quote 82 kilometers later. A little later. 3 hours later. 1 season later. Many secret patties later. Moments later. 1 nap later. 1 very long digestive tract later. 6 months later. 1 pathetic sob story later. Later. Many minutes later. 3 hours later. The next morning. 1 shift later. The next day. The next morning. The next. Yawn, cough. The next morning. Later that night. The next day. 1 weekend of pampering later. 1 hour later. Late again. You get the idea. 8 semesters later. 5,000 celebrities later. 6 months later. Meanwhile. 1 little boost to the surface later. A few minutes later. 1 hour later. 5 billion years later. The next morning. Later. Later that night. The next evening. One operation later. 1,000,000, zillion, jillion, dillion, cotillion times later. 1 hour later. Meanwhile,